Many of you be aware, SIP2 is the largest trade union in Ireland. We have 180,000 members, and I suppose we take very seriously the issue of infrastructure and the rollout of infrastructure in this country in terms of the expansion of the productive capacity of this country. So I suppose just to kick off and just say a lot of, there's been a lot already covered here this morning, but if we think about it, this is the 5th National Development Plan, the second, I suppose, spatial strategy that we've had over the last 3 decades, and notwithstanding a recommendation by the ESRI back in 1999, it's taken until now to have the NDP and the National Planning Framework to be aligned. I think in terms of how we think about this, and I know this has been already covered, but for me it's certainly useful to think about it that the National Planning Framework is the umbrella framework for infrastructural development and spatial development in this country over the next 20 years. And the NDP is just one component of that in terms of its implementation, because of course there is the regional and economic and spatial strategies, there's the current expenditure planning, there's a number of national strategic outcomes that are identified in the National Planning Framework, and of course not all of those can be delivered by the National Development Plan, so it's important just to put that in context. So really, I suppose what I want to talk here today about are just 2 things. A, can it be done? And B, is it enough in terms of the National Development Plan? And when we're thinking about the NDP and how realistic is it to expect it to be delivered, then I want to look at 3 just main issues in terms of the fiscal constraints, labour supply constraints, and I suppose operational constraints. And the second, and I suppose probably more important issue is it sufficient? So I think there has probably been less of a focus in any of the commentary and discussion about the NDP with regards to the net new or additional capital that is going to be developed over the next decade, and probably too little emphasis on what the quality and quantity of what we already have in terms of our capital stock. So I just want to reflect a little bit on that. So I suppose to put in macroeconomic context, I think the first thing to say, or the chief, I suppose, finding in all this, is that really the additional spending commitment is really quite modest. When you look over the next 10 years, in cumulative terms, is about 5.8 billion more than what the state is currently spending in capital expenditure at this point in time. It's well within the fiscal rules. And I suppose the other thing to put in context is obviously we're coming from a very low base. So we're second only to Portugal this year in terms of public investment or capital spending as a share of our national income. I think probably a more insightful way of putting it is looking at the spend over the last 2.5 decades. And what we see between 2000 and 2008, which is obviously a period of very significant infrastructural development in this country, we saw the average spend was about 5% per annum as a share of modified gross national income. And I'm sure you're all aware of the new metric now that has been developed by the CSO in response to the difficulties with GDP, which is the GNI star, or modified gross national income. So it was averaging 5% per annum between 2000 and 2008, and when we project ahead between 2018 and 2028, we see that it averages about 3.76 or 3.8% per year. So even by the time we get to 2027, capital spending will be still, will be at the long-term trend, but will be below what the level of spend was during the boom years in this country. There's also been an awful lot of talk with regards to meeting or now getting to a point where we exceed the EU average. But I think it's important to realise that the EU average, or certainly the Eurozone average, has not remained fixed over time. So when you look at between 1998 and 2008, so a 2-year period, and if you take the countries that make up the Eurozone, capital spending there averaged about 3.5% as a share of GDP. That now is down to, over the last decade, to 2.5%. So yes, we will exceed the Eurozone average over the next decade, but certainly the average amongst the Eurozone countries has been declining over time. So in terms of, I suppose, just the key risks to delivery. So 3, political, economic, labour supply and operational, as I said. And I suppose, just with regards to the political and economic. So the National Development Plan is going to at least span 3 governments. This current government, probably the next government, and maybe all or the next or the third government away. And if you look at the scheduling of the National Development Plan, then about 60% of that spend is backloaded to the period 2023 to 2027. So at least 2 governments away. So there's a political risk inherent in all that. That there is this plan that has been set out now, but the real implementation or delivery of that plan is 2 governments away. There's a cyclical risk. So at the moment, government policy is to that all exchequer financed expenditure would come from within own resources from 2020. So the targeting of general government balances from 2019-2020 on. So there's no guarantees of an outlay or a capital spend in the event of a downturn. We don't have any clarity from government at this point in time on whether they will actually begin borrowing to roll out capital investment in the event of a downturn. And I suppose this leads me into the issue of Brexit. So the lion's share of the outlay or the capital spend is, is ultimately timed, not purposely, but of course it happens to coincide with what will potentially be the biggest period of impact arising from Brexit. And of course we've no idea what the shape of Brexit is going to look like yet, albeit we're getting more pessimistic as the days go on. But certainly when you look at the timing of it, the early 2020s, then there is a serious timing issue there. So with regards to labour supply, well, I think there's 2 factors here. So actually, what is the scale of the public capital programme relative to total investment activity? And if we look at the moment in 2018, the scale of the public capital programme relative to gross fixed capital formation in this country, and again, we take the modified value of that, so because obviously there's an issue with, again, our national statistics and certain purchases, I suppose, of capital assets that are, have contaminated, if I can put it like that, the gross capital fixed formation over the last number of years. So if we take the modified version, then capital spending is averaging about 1/5 of total investment activity, modified investment activity in this country at the moment. And if we project ahead over the next 10 years and assume that investment activity is going to parallel gross national income over the next 10 years and where those projections are, then that share is going to remain the same. So it's not it's not going to overwhelm or certainly, I suppose, private activity is very much going to be much larger relative to public activity. But the second, I suppose, key factor in terms of when we look at labour supply is in terms of the labour intensity of the NDP. And I suppose the first thing is to actually look at, well, where is the sectoral allocation of the spend over the next 10 years? And we see there between energy, water infrastructure and transport, they account for just under half of all spent over the next 10 years. I suppose the real issue of interest is that construction intensity within the 116 billion that is planned. And if we see there somewhere between 64 and 69%, we haven't yet got an absolute full breakdown of the 116 billion, but from what we can tell, about 64% of the total spend will be in construction related activities. And you see there it's broken down into installation activities, building and civil engineering. So with the benefit of estimates that were produced by the Department of Public Expenditure Reform back in 2015 with regards to the labour intensity of construction projects, we're able to estimate that on or around over the next 10 years, about 60,000, just over 60,000 construction jobs will be sustained in construction arising from projects under the NDP. So relative to the construction employment at the moment, which is at about 144,000, we expect that to rise by over 70,000, or we need it to rise by over 70,000 to meet housing demand over the next number of years. That increase in demand or that construction labour demand is not huge over the 10 years. But there is an issue, though, that if we're going to see a ramping up of private housing demand with the NDP spending, where do we actually find that labour over the next decade? But I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation. So the second issue then, I suppose, or the second factor of concern is what I call operational risk. And I suppose very usefully, the IMF produced a report back in 2017 which looked at public investment management assessment. It was the PIMA report, and I suppose highlighted what we do well, or what the public sector here does well in terms of planning for public investment, and where there are areas of improvement. And I suppose there were a number of areas of improvement, and I'm singling out two here. And in terms of multi-year total project budgeting and budget unity. And what they mean by budget unity is the capital and current spend associated with the rollout of a project. And the second issue is with regards to public asset accounting systems. And when you compare, let's say, with the UK and Northern Ireland, where there is a register of public assets, we don't have that in this country. Very patchy information with regards to the quantity and, of course, quality then of public assets in this country. So arising from that, I suppose, there are two questions here. A, in terms of, as I say, the operational risk, and there's no profiling of additional current expenditure required to operate new capital projects. So if we think back, there's a history of underutilisation of equipment in the health sector, let's say over the past 2 decades. So the capital funding is put in place for equipment, and the corresponding current outlay has not been planned and provided for. So there is a lag in terms of the operability of that equipment. And certainly I think one of the things, and certainly any of you who have particular interest in the education sector may have noted that there's 2 billion of an allocation to universities over the next 10 years, and yet the issue with regards to operational funding in third level sector has not yet been addressed. So there's a real issue there with regards to how current expenditure is planned and profiled for, and I think with the exception of the capital appraisal framework within the Department of Transport, the work that's conducted within Irish Water, and of course the work that's conducted when a PPP has been set out, our understanding is that there is very, I suppose, patchy or limited time given to the profiling of current expenditure and projects outside of those three areas, or if it is done, it's not published. And I think the second issue then is with regards to the efficiency of capital spending in the absence of full information on existing stock. So really what I'm talking about there is, you know, we have an obsession with new infrastructure and new capital, I suppose, new projects, but we don't have a good understanding, arguably, of the operating costs, the maintenance and depreciation costs, and the general quality of existing infrastructure in this country in certain sectors. And I suppose there's a certain irony that when you look at, there's a certain irony that you know, the next frontier of policy or internal policy with regards to capital capital planning within departments has to be looking at the starting point of the process, so understanding what we have now before we can actually understand what we need to build into the future. So I just want to talk a little bit about the catching up process and the role of depreciation in terms of, you know, how we actually look at the total value of capital spending that is going to be rolled out over the next decade. And interestingly, back in 2016, the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council did some work on this, looking at the share of depreciation in total capital spend. And during the worst years of the crisis, one of their key findings that there was the net new additions to the capital stock were close to zero, because it was any capital investment that was in place was for maintenance. That depreciation and maintenance costs accounted for about 90% of the capital programme in 2012-2013, and in 2017 we're expecting, or certainly our own calculations would estimate that it's accounting for about 68% of total capital investment. So if we look ahead over the next 10 years, and we have certain assumptions built in here as to depreciation and how it will move over the next 10 years. So if we hold a constant, growing to about 4% per year, then we know that the gross capital stock is going to grow by about 3.76% per annum over the next decade, but the net capital stock is likely to grow by about half of that. So I think that's very important in terms of understanding just exactly what is likely to be undertaken over the next number of years, that we are catching up with unmet demand in certain areas, certain sectors of the public sector, and obviously then building to meet that demand. So meeting the unmet and then building to meet the future demand. So I suppose the last thing I kind of part of the presentation I just wanted to kind of say a little bit about is, is the NDP sufficient to meet future infrastructural needs? And of course we could be talking all day across the various sectors, but in particular housing, certainly to me is the chief concern at the moment. And it's interesting because when we think about the rationale for public investment, I suppose typically there's a number of key rationales. So in terms of market failure, corrective pricing, whether there's a public good or a semi-public good, or whether there's a redistributive need. And I suppose housing, when we think about it in the context of capital investment or the state's spend, we think of it as a redistributive element of a capital plan. But I suppose thankfully macroeconomics and the work of new economic geography over the last decade has done an awful lot to actually place housing much more centre stage in terms of the positive spillover effects to the macroeconomy if you have adequate housing supply. And it's interesting because in the National Development Plan, they talk about the plan being very much built to resolve the underlying issues of the housing crisis that we now have. Now, they say that, and yet just over 13.5%, I think, is being allocated of the total NDP spend towards housing. So I suppose we can talk about that in a second. But going back to the umbrella document, the National Planning Framework, and as Ronan said earlier, it projects a need of about 550,000 houses over the next 20 years. Within the National Development Plan, we have supports in place for approximately 26,000 houses. Now, it is not entirely clear that figure approximately should be underlined there, because we have the spending by the local authorities, we have the LEHAF fund, and then there's the Urban Regeneration Fund. So we have to get more precise figures, but certainly when you look at the scale of the state supports and what the state says we actually need in terms of housing supply over the next number of years, there's certainly a bit of a gap. I think the other issue is what is actually projected by the National Planning Framework itself. And I know others, Stephen and others might have said earlier, that there's been a bit of drama about the revision to the population estimates during the summer. But there are two issues here. So there has been a revision to the population estimates since the National Planning Framework was published at the start of this year. So the National Planning Framework assumes a growth of 1.1 million. So that's based on our three, I suppose, drivers of population growth. So in terms of fertility, being about 1.8 per female, 1.8 per female over the next 2 decades, mortality rates remaining fairly much the same as they are now, and certain migration populations. And during the summer, we had a fairly significant upward revision of the migration projections over the next number of decades. And that feeds into, I suppose, the demand for housing and the projections for housing. So we estimate at the moment that the National Planning Framework, in terms of its population projections, could be out by somewhere of the region of 280,000 persons over the next 2 decades in terms of its population projection. And then the second thing is with regards to its housing projection. Well, Ronan talked very eloquently and in much greater detail than what I have here about the issue of household formation. And I suppose what I have put up here is the OECD and certainly our own estimates then very much tally with what the OECD and what Ronan has been saying earlier with regards to household formation. So rather than it remaining fairly constant as it, or actually marginally increased between the period 2011 to 2016, because as we assume more people ended up being forced into live into multi-occupancy households as opposed to single occupancy as they may have wished. In terms of if we assume that demand for 1 and 2 person housing rises over the next 2 years, then certainly and that household formation size falls, then we're looking at an average of 50,000 residences, so dwellings, being required every year over the next 20 years, as opposed to the 30 to 35,000 houses that the National Planning Framework projects post-2020. So there's a very sizable gap there in terms of the number of houses, and accordingly how policy and government is going to respond. So the last thing I just wanted to conclude on, I suppose, is the labour supply issue. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a real concern now that the period of when we're going to see the greatest rollout of the NDP is going to coincide with a significant ramping up of private housing supply. And the issue is, do we have enough workers? So I suppose, obviously, I work for SIP2. We have a very significant membership in the construction sector. And I suppose from that we've been able to glean a number of key insights that haven't necessarily been discussed publicly on why there is a capacity constraint or a supply constraint with regards to increasing labour or the number of people in construction. And at the moment, migration and inward migration is the key prescription to resolve our labour supply crisis. But as the point was made earlier, and I think in a number of occasions, with regards to housing demand over the next number of decades, this isn't a temporary increase that we need to try and fill with regards to manpower over the next 2 or 3 years. This is a permanent increase, a shift level increase in residential housing need every year over the next 2 or more decades. So migration is certainly necessary, but it can't be the only tool we use to try and meet that housing supply shortage. And arguably there's an issue with regards to pay and conditions. And one of the key insights that certainly we have from our members who have exited the construction sector, because obviously during the downturn there was a huge hemorrhaging of workers out of the sector, and those who are currently in the sector, is that there's an issue with regards to alternative employment opportunities. So it may be lower paid, but because it's lower intensity and more consistent employment in alternative sectors, then that incentive to go back into construction is certainly lower now than what it was. And there's a number of key reasons for that. So if we look at the demography of the construction sector over the last number of years, there's arguably a number of key features there that have contributed to the growing shortage of craft and semi-skilled construction workers. And if we look at firm size, so the distribution is already very much skewed towards very small firms, but we're seeing increasing fragmentation amongst the construction sector, so a move towards even smaller firms. And I talked there about moving to less than 2 per construction firm from 2015 on. And the second thing is with regards to vertical disintegration. I don't know if many of you are familiar or not with the actual construction process, but in general there's 5 stages to construction process. And whereas before, let's say if we take the Dublin Port project, or the Port Tunnel project, when it was being built 10, 12 years ago, there was typically a main contractor and then 1 or maybe 2 subcontractors. And now we have additional layers brought in. So we'll have the main contractor, we'll have subcontractor, we'll have subcontractor underneath that, and we may have a subcontractor underneath that. And all that, and I suppose the key issue with regards to all that is with regards to how we train and retain staff into the future. The other feature is that there's an increasing reliance on temporary agency workers for the general operative grade. So there's almost no direct employment now. So going back to their vertical disintegration, main contractors are not employing on the scale that they once were workers in the construction sector. So there's less direct employment, and of course there's an implication from that in terms of the certainty of employment. So what is the implications of all that? In terms of being able to take on apprenticeships. So I project there where apprenticeships were in 2017 relative to where they were, and we know they need to grow very significantly to meet the skills demand. And at the moment, because firms are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, there's an insufficient staff to apprentice ratio for firms to be able to take on apprenticeships. So fewer firms are able to take on apprentices. Apprentices have fewer places to go. The second issue is with regards to the semi-skilled construction worker. They require what is called a ticket. So if I come in as a general operative and I want to become a crane driver over time, I have to acquire what is called a ticket. And again, those opportunities within firms to be able to train up are fewer and fewer because of the lack of direct employment. So I suppose ultimately those key issues, those structural issues within the construction sector have to be looked at and resolved if we are to very much increase the number of workers in that sector to meet housing supply and housing demand over the next 2 decades. And I suppose just to sum up, the original question was, will it deliver Ireland's infrastructure needs? Well, we know the additional spend is modest. I don't think there's a substantive risk of it contributing to the overheating of the economy, but there is a timing issue with regards to those early 2020s and particularly Brexit. And I think probably the biggest issue certainly for us is that the Housing Development Plan underestimates the scale and type of future housing need. Thank you.